Listen up. Before we start this story, my name is the Faceless Detective, and I've got a warning. If you don't hit that like button, I heard a haunted potato will show up at your house and refuse to leave. Seriously, it'll just sit there on your couch, eating chips. How's that even possible? I don't know, but you probably don't want to find out. So go on, hit that like button and keep your couch potato-free. While you're at it, hit subscribe too, because that's way less scary than this story. All right, you did it? Great.
My wife, Mia, and I have been together for 6 years and married for 11 months. Everything about our relationship has been normal. Nothing out of the ordinary, no strange behaviors, no red flags. I can't stress enough how out of character this entire thing is for her. Mia is kind, smart, and thoughtful. She's always been the no-nonsense type. Being childish or pulling pranks just isn't her style. In fact, she's not even into horror. When we first started dating, she tried watching The Shining with me because she knew how much I love scary movies, but she barely made it halfway before begging me to turn it off. That's why what happened next was so weird, because this is not the Mia I know. I also want to mention that Mia's never had any mental health issues, and as far as I know, there's no history of it in her family. I know some people can hide things like that, but in the 6 years we've been together, I think I would have noticed something, but I didn't. It all started in mid-October, and I was in the kitchen making coffee before heading out to work. I was running a bit late, so I was rushing down the hallway, coffee in hand. As I turned the corner to the front door, I nearly jumped out of my skin. There was Mia, peeking at me from around the corner. All I could see were her eyes and a single strand of her dark hair dangling against the wall. The rest of her was hidden. I let out a surprised yelp and ended up spilling some of my coffee. "Geez, Mia," I shouted, trying to wipe the coffee off my pants. "You scared the crap out of me." As soon as I spoke, she immediately ducked back out of sight, just like a little kid who got caught doing something naughty. I heard her giggle softly as she scurried off towards the living room. By the time I got to the front door, she was gone. It was strange for sure, but I just laughed it off. I thought, maybe she's just trying to be playful, lighten up a bit. I shouted that I loved her and called her a weirdo. I heard her laughing as I shut the door behind me. Her behavior was definitely odd, but nothing to get too worried about. I mean, everyone acts goofy once in a while, right? I shrugged it off and didn't think about it again. 3 days later, though, things got a little more intense. It was around 2 a.m. I'd woken up thirsty and went to the kitchen to grab a drink. I stood there, half asleep, chugging orange juice straight from the jug, when I got this feeling, you know the one, like you're being watched. I glanced down at the floor, and there was Mia. She was lying on her stomach on the other side of the kitchen island, peeking up at me from the floor with wide, unblinking eyes and this huge, creepy grin plastered across her face. She looked like the freaking Cheshire Cat. I screamed, not out of anger or frustration, but genuine fear. And at the sound of my scream, Mia scuttled backward out of sight, her hands and feet smacking the tiles as she scrambled away like some kind of crab. I just stood there, frozen, trying to process what the hell I'd just seen. It was terrifying. When I finally made it back upstairs, Mia was lying on her side in bed, asleep, or at least pretending to be. I stood there for what felt like forever, just staring at her, watching her breathe, wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. The next morning, I waited until she'd had her coffee before casually asking her about it. I expected her to laugh it off or admit she was just messing with me, but when I asked, she looked genuinely confused. "What are you talking about?" she asked, frowning over her coffee. I pointed to the spot on the kitchen floor. "You were down there, staring up at me, grinning like a lunatic." She followed my gaze and then burst out laughing. She laughed so hard that I couldn't help but join in. "You creep me out sometimes, you know that?" I teased, shaking my head. "You creep me out all the time, so I guess we're even," she replied, giggling. And just like that, everything felt normal again. We kissed goodbye and went to work like any other day. But then it happened again, and again, and again. Over the next couple of weeks, I'd catch her peeking at me from all sorts of weird places, behind the couch, from around the shower curtain. Once, she even managed to squeeze herself inside her grandmother's old trunk at the foot of our bed, propping the lid up just enough for one of her eyes to peek through. Each time she'd have that same unnerving grin, her eyes wide and unblinking. I'd ask her why she was doing it, but she'd just smile wider or disappear entirely. It was starting to mess with my head. One night while we were watching Netflix, I joked about how she hadn't been peeking at me lately. She looked up at me with a small smile and said, "Maybe I've just gotten better at it." That line haunted me for days. A few nights later, Mia said she was going to a friend's place. I decided to take a long shower to unwind. I was rinsing the soap out of my hair when I felt that familiar sensation, the feeling of being watched. I slowly opened my eyes and my heart almost stopped. Mia was standing just outside the shower curtain, leaning in, her head stretched into the shower, leaving her body outside. Her long, wet hair hung down, the ends dripping with water. Her makeup was smeared, and she had that same horrible grin on her face. I screamed and stumbled back, pressing myself against the wall. Mia's expression didn't change. She didn't move or flinch. Her mouth was stretched open in that terrible smile, her eyes wide and bloodshot as if she hadn't blinked in hours. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. Then, as slowly as she had appeared, Mia pulled her head back out of the shower. I watched her blurry silhouette through the curtain as she backed away. A second later, the bathroom door slammed shut so hard it rattled the walls. I screamed again and jumped out of the shower, locking the door behind me. I stayed in that bathroom for an hour, trying to calm myself down. What the hell was wrong with her? This wasn't a prank anymore. This was terrifying. I tried listening for any sound on the other side of the door, but all I could hear was my own heart pounding in my chest. After a long while, I finally gathered the courage to unlock the door. I slowly crept out and looked around, expecting her to jump out at me, but she wasn't there. I tiptoed down the hall, half expecting her to be hiding around every corner, but then I heard a quiet, raspy sound, almost like a moan. It was coming from the closet. My stomach dropped. I turned my head and locked eyes with Mia. She was peeking out at me from the slight gap in the closet door, her wide grin still plastered across her face, her eyes wider than I'd ever seen them. She didn't move, didn't say a word. She just stared at me, her body trembling with excitement. I couldn't handle it anymore. I bolted down the stairs, grabbed my car keys, and drove straight to my brother's house. I drove like a bat out of hell, my hands shaking so badly on the steering wheel, I thought I might swerve off the road. I don't even remember how I made it to my brother's place without getting into an accident. The entire way, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Mia sprinting after me in the darkness, or peeking out at me from the back seat. But of course, there was nothing there. No sign of her. No sign of anything. I stumbled out of the car when I finally reached Matt's house and banged on his front door like a madman. He opened it almost immediately, his face full of confusion and concern. "Ben? What the hell, man?" he asked, his eyes scanning over me. I must have looked like a complete mess. Hair disheveled, still in my pajamas, no shoes. I could barely speak. I need to stay here. I can't go back there," I panted, my breath coming out in short gasps. Matt's concern deepened, but he didn't press for details. He just nodded, stepping aside, and gesturing for me to come in. "Of course, man. Come in. Stay as long as you need," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. I collapsed onto his couch, every muscle in my body feeling like it had turned to jelly. Matt's wife, Sarah, came out of the kitchen, looking at me like I'd just escaped from a mental institution. "Ben, what's going on? Are you okay?" she asked gently. I didn't answer. I didn't know how to answer. What could I say? That my wife was sneaking around the house, staring at me with that grotesque grin plastered on her face? That I was terrified of my own spouse? That sounded insane, and yet it was the truth. I forced myself to take a few deep breaths, trying to get a hold of myself. "Mia, she's not herself," I finally managed to say. "Something's wrong with her. She's not acting right." Matt frowned, exchanging a worried glance with Sarah. "What do you mean, not acting right? What's going on?" I shook my head, rubbing my eyes with the heels of my hands. "I don't know, man. It's like she's watching me all the time, staring at me from weird places, smiling at me. I can't explain it. It's like she's trying to mess with me. But it's not funny, it's terrifying. Matt and Sarah just stared at me, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. I couldn't blame them. I sounded like a lunatic. But I could see something else in their eyes too. Concern, fear even. They could see how serious I was, how terrified I was. Ben, maybe you just need some sleep, Sarah suggested softly. You look exhausted. Why don't you try to get some rest? And we'll talk more in the morning. I knew they thought I was just sleep deprived, that maybe I was seeing things because I was so stressed out. But I didn't argue. I was too tired, too drained to fight. So I just nodded and let them lead me to the guest room. I lay down on the bed, staring up at the ceiling, but I knew there was no way I'd be able to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. I heard that soft, raspy giggle. I imagined her hiding in the shadows, watching me with those unblinking eyes. The hours dragged by, and I felt like I was losing my mind. I kept glancing over at the window, expecting to see her face peeking in. But the window remained empty, the darkness outside thick and suffocating. It wasn't until dawn finally started to break that I managed to drift off into a fitful, restless sleep. I didn't wake up until noon. When I finally stumbled out of the guest room, Matt and Sarah were sitting at the kitchen table, talking in low voices. They stopped when they saw me, exchanging worried glances. Hey, man, Matt said cautiously. How are you feeling? I shrugged, rubbing the back of my neck. I don't know. Better, I guess, but I don't think I can go back home. Matt nodded slowly. You don't have to. Stay here as long as you need, but I think you should talk to someone, maybe get some help. I knew what he meant. He thought I was having some sort of breakdown, that it was all in my head, and maybe he was right. But that didn't change what I'd seen, what I'd experienced. My phone buzzed on the table, and I hesitated before picking it up. There was a new message from an unknown number. My blood ran cold as I read it. I miss you. Come home. Attached was a photo. It was my bedroom window, taken from outside. There was a dark figure standing behind the glass, but it was hard to make out any details. My hands were shaking as I showed the message to Matt and Sarah. What the hell is this? Matt whispered, his eyes wide. Is that Mia? I nodded slowly. I don't know how she found me. I don't know what she wants, but she's following me. We called the police, but they didn't take it seriously. They said there wasn't enough evidence, that it was probably just a prank. They suggested I get a restraining order, but I knew that wouldn't stop her. Nothing would stop her. That night, I lay awake on the couch, staring at the ceiling. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind sent my heart racing. I kept expecting to see her face at the window, staring in at me with that awful smile. But the night passed without incident. When I finally drifted off, it was to dreams of Mia, of her grinning at me from the shadows, her eyes wide and unblinking. I woke up covered in sweat, my heart hammering in my chest. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a pale light through the windows. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, trying to shake off the remnants of the nightmare. And that's when I felt it, that sensation of being watched. I turned my head slowly, my eyes drifting to the window beside the couch. My blood turned to ice. Mia's face was pressed up against the glass, staring down at me with that same gaping smile. Her breath was fogging up the glass, and there were 2 long streaks of drool running down the pane. I didn't know how long she'd been there. She could have been standing there all night watching me. I didn't scream. I didn't move. I just stared at her, too afraid to look away. Finally, she stepped back, her face disappearing from view. I scrambled to my feet, peering out the window, but she was gone. Just like that. No sign of her anywhere. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out with shaking hands and read the message. You can't hide forever. I threw my phone across the room, my whole body trembling. I knew I couldn't stay here. I had to go somewhere. Anywhere but here. I grabbed my car keys and ran out the door, not even bothering to explain to Matt and Sarah. I jumped into my car and drove off, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't have a destination in mind. I just needed to get away. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was right behind me, watching me. And then my phone buzzed again. Another message. Turn around. I glanced in the rearview mirror, my heart in my throat. There she was, sitting in the back seat, her face twisted into that same awful, unhinged grin. "You can't hide, Ben. I'll always find you." I swerved off the road, barely managing to stop the car without crashing. I spun around in my seat, my eyes wide with terror, but the back seat was empty. No sign of her. No sign of anything. I sat there gasping for breath, my mind racing. Was I losing it? Was I really going insane? I don't know. I don't know what's real anymore. All I know is that no matter where I go, she'll find me. She'll always find me. And I'm terrified of what'll happen when she does. I sat there for what felt like hours, just staring at the empty back seat, trying to calm myself down. My breathing was ragged, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might explode. What the hell was happening to me? Was I really going crazy? Maybe Matt was right. Maybe I needed help. But I knew that no doctor, no psychiatrist could help me with this. This wasn't just in my head. Mia, whatever she was now, was real, and she was out there, somewhere, watching me. I forced myself to start the car again, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. I couldn't go back to Matt's. I didn't want to put him and Sarah in danger. They didn't believe me. Not really. But I'd seen the fear in their eyes. The way they looked at me, like I was some kind of ticking time bomb. No, I couldn't go back there. I needed somewhere else to go. Somewhere safe. Somewhere Mia wouldn't think to look. That's when I thought of it. The old cabin up in the mountains. My dad had bought it years ago as a hunting retreat, and I'd only been there once or twice. It was remote, hidden away in the woods. Perfect for hiding out until I could figure out what to do next. Mia wouldn't know about it. She couldn't. With a newfound determination, I pulled out onto the road and started driving. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows across the empty highway. The drive was long, winding up through narrow mountain roads, and the farther I went, the more isolated I felt. Trees loomed on either side of me, dark and foreboding, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. By the time I finally pulled up to the cabin, it was completely dark. The air was cold and still, and the only sound was the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. I stepped out of the car and glancing around nervously. The cabin was exactly as I remembered it. Small, rustic, and a little run down, but it would do. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me and breathing a sigh of relief. I'd made it. I was safe. At least for now. I flicked on the lights, the bulbs casting a dim, yellow glow over the small living room. There was an old couch, a coffee table covered in a thick layer of dust, and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I dropped my bag on the couch and collapsed beside it, burying my face in my hands. God, what had my life become? How had everything gone so horribly wrong? I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. It's going to be okay, I told myself. I just needed to stay here, away from Mia, until I could figure out what was going on. I'd get through this. I'd get help. I'd find a way to save her, to bring her back to the woman I'd married. But deep down, a part of me knew it was already too late for that. I stood up and began to explore the cabin, making sure all the windows were locked and that there were no other ways inside. Everything seemed secure. I moved into the tiny bedroom, shoving the bed up against the door just in case. Then I went back to the living room and slumped down on the couch, exhaustion washing over me like a tidal wave. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a loud thump. My heart leapt into my throat and I shot up, glancing around wildly. The cabin was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the curtains. I held my breath, straining to listen. Thump. There it was again. It was coming from outside. I crept over to the window, my hands shaking as I pulled the curtain back just enough to peek out. The moon was high in the sky, casting long shadows across the front yard. And then I saw it. Movement, just at the edge of the tree line. A figure slowly making its way towards the cabin. My blood turned to ice. It was Mia. She was walking slowly, almost casually, her head tilting from side to side, as if she was looking for something. Or someone. I ducked down, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. How had she found me? This place was miles from anywhere. There was no way she could have known I was here. I stayed hidden, barely daring to breathe, as she came closer. I could see her more clearly now, her long, dark hair hanging in wet, matted clumps around her face. Her clothes were dirty and torn, her arms hanging limply at her sides. But it was her face that terrified me the most. That smile, that awful wide grin that stretched across her face, her teeth gleaming in the moonlight. She stopped just a few feet from the front door, her head tilting slightly as she stared at the cabin. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying she would go away. But then, I heard it. "Ben?" Her voice was soft, almost sing-song, drifting through the quiet night air. "Come out, Ben. I know you're in there." My breath caught in my throat. How did she know? I hadn't made a sound. I stayed perfectly still, not daring to move a muscle. "Ben," she called again, a hint of irritation creeping into her voice. "Come on, I just want to see you." There was a pause, and then in a voice so low I could barely hear it, she whispered, "I'll always find you." My entire body was trembling. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't go outside, I couldn't face her. But I couldn't stay here either. She'd get in eventually. Somehow I just knew she would. I heard a rustling sound and then the faint creak of the porch steps. My heart stopped. She was coming closer. "Ben!" Her voice was right outside the door now. I squeezed my eyes shut, tears streaming down my face. "Please just go away." There was a loud bang as something slammed against the door, making me jump. She was pounding on it now, the sound echoing through the tiny cabin. I clamped my hands over my ears, trying to block it out. "Please, Mia, please go away," I whispered, my voice breaking. The banging stopped. I slowly lowered my hands, my heart still racing. Had she left? Was it over? I crept over to the door, my hands shaking as I reached for the doorknob. I had to check. I had to make sure she was gone. But just as I was about to turn the knob, there was a loud crash as the door burst open, slamming against the wall. I stumbled backward, my eyes widening in horror. Mia stood in the doorway, her face twisted into that same horrific grin. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, her body trembling with excitement. "Found you," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. I turned and ran, my feet barely touching the ground as I bolted through the cabin, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear her behind me, her footsteps quick and light, almost playful. I ran into the bedroom, slamming the door shut and pushing the bed against it with all my strength. But it was no use. I heard her laughing. Soft, raspy giggles that sent chills down my spine. The door rattled violently as she began pounding on it, the wood splintering under the force of her blows. "Come on, Ben," she crooned. "Don't you want to see me?" I backed away, my eyes darting around the room, searching for something, anything that could help me. My gaze landed on the small window above the bed. It was tiny, barely big enough to squeeze through, but it was my only chance. I scrambled onto the bed, throwing the window open and hoisting myself up. I could hear the door cracking behind me, and I knew I didn't have much time. I shoved my body through the window, grunting as I pulled myself out, and dropped to the ground below. I hit the ground hard, pain shooting up my legs, but I didn't stop. I pushed myself to my feet and took off into the woods, branches slapping against my face as I ran. I could hear her behind me, her laughter echoing through the trees. "Ben, don't run from me!" I didn't look back, I just kept running, my lungs burning, my heart pounding in my chest. The woods were dark and disorienting, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I went, I could still hear her.